Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining our workshop today. Today we are going to talk about major piece in games. So such in games where we have rooks, usually rooks, and sometimes it can be the endgame with queens. Is queen and one rook still considered to be the endgame? Yeah, well, it depends. Many will argue with me, but we are going to cover it too. So some positions where we have queen and rooks. Okay, so people are joining. Let's wait. By the way, is there anybody who attends our workshop at the first time? If you didn't join earlier, please let me know which country you are from. Well, you can introduce you a little if you want, but just which country you are watching this event, and also what is your ELO. It can be either feed rating or your chess.com ELO. It's only if you're there is a chat, yes. So most of the, yeah, Hunter. So most of the time of the class, I want you to keep your microphone muted, and when you want to say something, you can unmute yourself. And for example, if you need to answer the questions that I ask, you can unmute yourself and say it. Okay. Ayush from India with chess.com rating above 1800. Great. By the way, if you like the event, it would be great if you can share it with your friends, chess players, and invite them to join our next event, which will be next Sunday. So I'm doing such workshops every Sunday. Well, sometimes I miss them, but mainly because if only I have vacation or I have some other activities already scheduled. Okay, Hunter has chess.com rating of almost 1300. And okay, perfect. Okay, so major piece endgame, what we should discuss? Well, rook endgame, four-rook endgame, queen endgame, and some queen and one rook positions. So, for example, this one. What we should remember, what typical ideas we should have then? Well, if there are a lot of pieces, then you may consider attacking on the king, especially if there are queens on the board. You should try to advance your pawns, of course, and execute some attacks which allow you to bring one piece from one side of the board to the other side of the board in just one move. Also, you may look for some letter mates ideas, some attacks through the files and ranks, and of course tactics with promotion of your pawn. For example, there is enemy queen blocking the pawn, and you sacrifice your queen for the enemy rook to distract the queen and then just advance the pawn. It works very often. Why you say so? Why d6? uh, okay, so advancing the pawn in this position. Yeah, okay, so now keep your microphone muted. Okay, thanks. What do we see? Yeah, well, d6 is definitely a plan to progress, but does it allow us to win? Actually, not if black plays properly. After d6, rook e7 becomes a threat. That's true, so that's why most likely they react with rook c6 move. Now rook e7 is just a blunder, we blunder the pawn. And now we are tied down to this move. I mean, our rook is tied down to the pawn's protection. Well, luckily their pieces are also tied down. Once they move the queen, d7 and d8, and we win the game. And because of that, such positions are very difficult to play, especially for black. And black makes their first mistake. It's not a significant mistake, but they played f6. So, okay. Hunter asks if white is lost here. Why do you think white is lost? I don't think so. Even if just white keeps doing such moves like queen d1, queen d3 maybe, or queen d1, queen d2, or rook d4, rook d5, how they are lost? The king is more vulnerable. Okay, so in this position, the king is more vulnerable. How to take advantage of it? Because once you move the queen to take advantage of the king's vulnerability, it's this. And, well, this can be played. And on the next move, it's d8 already. No, white is definitely not winning. If, let's say, it was this, without queens on the board and there was a rook, then I would say that the d6 pawn is lost because the king can come to f7 and d6 and attack the pawn one more time. What's the purpose of queen e3? What if they just take? We can make a pin, but with king e7, it seems that they can unpin. King e7, king e6, for example. So we lose a pawn. That's why I doubt. If you want to do the same scenario, it could make sense to play this move, queen d4. Or even just wait until they take and play queen b4. No, well, and queen e3 doesn't actually create a threat. The king is not more vulnerable at the moment. However, having the pawn on g3 should be quite promising and helpful. Rook d3 was played. What for? Well, just because they didn't know what exactly to do, how they can win. Not because we want to play rook c3, rook c3, rook d6. So rook c8. Well, they also ran out of moves. Well, if this move was played, then this could be a possibility. Because blocking means letting white to promote the pawn. Not blocking, for example, moving there, means invasion. So the king must go back. And then I think white would continue with something like that. I'm not saying that it wins the game. For example, king f7, and then I don't know what to play actually. Maybe defending the pawn with this move could make a lot of sense, and it looks like Zogzwang, right? So I can hardly suggest a good move. There is rook c1, but king h2, and what then? So that's why rook c8 was played, to cover the back rank. Sacrifice the queen there, maybe, but on c6 you mean? Good point, actually. I can sacrifice the queen. So this king f7, queen c6, queen c6. This there is a check. King goes to h2. Queen f4. g3 cannot be played. So it is a repetition if king g1. So king h3. Also, rook g3 is a bad move because they can simply stop the pawn with king e7 at least. G3 leads to a loss because after king h1, king h3, it's queen f1. And then queen d3, stopping the pawn. So queen f4, king h3 is a must. And it seems that after queen f5, it's still a loss. So no, sacrificing the queen was too risky. They would counterattack with their queen. If only we had the pawn on g3, then maybe. Anyway, rook c8 was played. Queen b4, protecting and attacking. So let's continue with from this position. So b5. the pawn was hanging. They didn't want to keep their pieces passive. So rook d5, potentially attacking this. Well, at the moment you are attacking this with your rook because d6 still will be protected. That's why they play rook d8 move. Now, if you capture, it should be a draw. If you capture with a rook, it still is a draw because you lose on d6 and then it's 3 versus 3 on one side. That's why white doesn't rush, he plays g3 move. King goes to f7, king h2, prophylaxis, queen e6. Well, the character of the position hasn't changed during the recent moves. And white continues making such moves which may provoke black to make a mistake. Well, queen e7 is a check. I'm not sure what for. Maybe queen here, then queen here attacking the pawn. So that's why they played rook d7. Now queen d3 attacking the pawn. And black moves the pawn further. Okay, so let me see what John suggests. In this position, rook b5, queen d6, earlier. Here. So king f7 was played. No. Here, rook d8 was played, rook b5, queen d6, rook d5. But the queen is hanging. Okay, so even if you do so, it's king e7. If the queen was protected, well, no, it doesn't work. Let's continue. So queen d3, the pawn goes further. Rook d4 was played. What is the concept of rook d4? If now, let's say, the pawn goes to b3, which becomes quite dangerous, then how could white continue here? The pawn overextended target with rook. I think white has already a concrete idea here. Rook b4. Rook b4 looks interesting, but rook b4, let's say it is what? Queen d6. Because I doubt that you can play queen g6. Well, you can play queen g6, but queen g6, let's say king g8, rook b8 is already a blunder. Isn't rook e4 attacking the queen more promising? Exactly, rook e4 attacking the queen, but how? With queen g6 first, king goes to f8, and then rook e4. This is promising. Well, if queen moves, you just do this. If queen goes to f7 to cover this square, it's queen h7. And now it seems that the position is lost because queen h8 is coming. The only way to prevent it is to play this move, but this move means rook e8, and then the queen is lost, and then everything is lost. The pawn is even lost too. So this is where rook e4 should be played. First queen g6 and then rook e4. If you did queen g6 in this position, for example, b4, queen g6, king g8 or f8, there is no rook e5. I mean, nothing like that which can help you. You can try rook b5, aiming to go there, but just here, and they stop everything. What you have is just a repetition. No, it is a repetition because there is no queen f8. You take the rook. Okay, let's continue. Rook d4 was played and they made a mistake. What they should do in this position? Just king g8 to avoid this check. Well, if this move is played, then it's rook d6. This is how they should play. But they played rook d8. Just a waiting move. And white played queen g6, which was a mistake too. Can you please suggest a better move for white, which could practically allow them to play for a win? So d7 is a candidate move. Well, as for d7, I'm not fully sure. d7, it can be b3. The black's idea is to exchange their b pawn for the d pawn, after which the position gets simplified. Okay, instead of d7, do you have any other ideas? Yeah, instead of writing, can you please make this move on the board? This is what was played on the in the game. Can you please remove it? Because queen to a6 is a possibility. Queen g6. Queen g6 was played in the game. It wasn't the best way to play. What does queen e6 do? Well, queen e6 allows you to deliver checks from there, so I'm not sure if it's so promising. Let's say this. And now if there is a check delivery, they can just play rook d7. What did you achieve with it? This is still protected. So trading queens means losing the d6. Well, of course, you can take the b pawn then, but it's a draw, 3 versus 3 on one side. Okay, instead, it could make sense to capture the pawn, because that would allow white to bring the rook to the 7th rank. For example, in case if rook takes d6, it's queen g6 with a mating attack. Yeah, we will talk about queen g6 and rook g4 a little later. So queen g6, how does it work? If the king goes to the back rank, it's simply this, and then it should be either checkmate with queen e8, right? So that's why after rook d6, you are completely winning. Okay, no, there is one more line to show you. King e7, here, rook blocks, but after queen g7, you have a winning endgame. Rook takes, rook queen takes, queen takes, king takes, then you are a pawn up in the pawn endgame, which is absolutely winning. But they could still play queen d6. But if so, the game would continue with queen c4. Moving the king there means this, and they are in trouble. Why they are in trouble? Well, because how can they play? So if they play what? Let's say queen here, then it's queen c7, threatening to do this and this. Queen h5 this time doesn't allow black to have a perpetual check. So king g1, it's rook d1. It's of course a mistake. And in this situation, there is a f3 move. And after queen d2, king goes to h3, and there are no more checks. So this is a blunder, not a check. But rook d7, no, rook d7 is not playable. Rook d7, queen d7. You mean in this position, rook d7? Okay, fine. In this position, it is playable. However, then this, check, Blocking, I think, is possible, but then you just play queen g4 and there is no rook d7. And how do you defend this? You can push g5, but there isn't passant and white should be winning. If you move the king, this time you have rook b3. There is also queen g8 move, but rook b3 and you continue the attack. Because you threaten with queen e8 mate once the king goes to f7. So king f8 would be already a mistake. After this move, the best option is king e7, which is not so obvious. Then rook checks. The rook has to block. And now you can win a pawn. Who can tell me how you can win a pawn in this position? Yeah, with queen g8. It's after rook takes b7, there is a skewer. Maybe black can still draw this game, but they can also lose it because their pawns are separated. We are already a pawn up, and there is always a risk that white trades queens and black lose this pawn in game. It's still, well, if you play against the engine will draw the game, but for a human player, it's really hard. So that's why rook b4 would provide white with winning chances. They didn't play so. They played queen g6, king f8, and then just repeated the position. The game ended in a draw. If rook b4 there, queen d6, no, it still doesn't look good because rook b7, rook d7. This time it works well. There is no queen c8 move. Okay, so let's say queen h7, king f7, and this is where you could try to capture on b4. For example, well, rook d6 loses because of this move, right? So rook d6, rook b8. And then you play queen g8 and they are under a strong attack. But if they take with a queen, then rook g4 becomes a possibility. However, queen f8 is sufficient. Queen g6, king g8. You can win a pawn, but how black should play in this position to equalize? Okay, so rook d5. So black white still can win a pawn, but after rook d no, rook d4. Rook d4 works too actually, but I wanted to play this move, rook d5 originally. And it's hard to suggest a good move. How do they progress? Because now opening the position means that they expose the king. For example, queen g6, and you can play queen f7, because if the queens are traded, this is a theoretical draw. If, let's say, h6 is played, this time there is rook h5 and queen takes, and then rook h6, which leads to a draw. Yeah, okay. Hello, Zamfir. It's great that you joined us. So today we are talking about major piece endgames, and that was queen and rook end game, if we can say so. It's not fully the end game, but let's say queen and rook position. And what do we have here? In order to play for a win, we should create mating opportunities for the king that we can exploit by either delivering checkmate or winning 1 or 2 pawns to get a winning endgame then. This is your concept. When you have queens on the board, you should focus on your pawn promotion as well as on the attack on the enemy king. So it can be the second weakness. The first is your passed pawn. The second is the enemy king's position that you are going to weaken and then attack with your pieces. This is the concept. Okay, let's continue with our next example. Yes, it is. Once again, what? And? But you a pawn down already. Are you sure it's favorable for white? Maybe white is not losing because the rook is already behind and is cutting the king off, but... And what do you suggest? Why do you suggest this line? Now white should fight for a draw. They are not going to win at all. No, you cannot take the pawn on f7. How you can take the pawn on f7? Well, okay, so what I want you to know is that even if the b6 pawn is lost, 3 versus 3 is still a draw. I don't think that black allows you to capture these pawns. Which king works over? So like that? Well, no, I don't think it's possible. I think that what should be done in this position? I don't see how black should play for win in this position, but it's definitely favorable for them. So let's say, well, let's say g5 and something like that, and then king g7 and try to activate the king. Just don't overlap the rook activity. So g5 and passant, rook g6, king g7, rook goes back, and then the king comes closer. How, okay, how can you walk, well, f6 and then what? You cannot go there. Okay, fine. How can, the question is, how can I win with being a pawn up in the position in queen endgame? Okay, so this is a tough question. So even with extra pawn, the queen endgame can be not winning due to a huge number of possibilities to deliver a perpetual check. However, you can play for a win if you find cross checks. So you should locate your king that way that if your opponent delivers a check, you can deliver a cross check and provoke a queen exchange. Because if you exchange the queens, you pass the game to a pawn in game where extra pawn almost guarantees a win. So, well, we have, okay, so if you're talking about this position, that could happen, what, this? If you're talking about this position, what white should do, they should advance their pawns, they should bring their king, and they should try to capture the pawn on h6. It's hard, but it can be a winning plan. And if something like that, the queens can be even exchanged with queen g6 move. Well, just make sure that you don't lose this pawn on g6 then. The king should be close. So cross checks, this is what you should be looking for. We have a course, a series of group lessons that we are doing right away. And the previous class yesterday was devoted to rook and minor piece in games. But the class before was exactly about queen in games. How to play, how to realize extra pawns. So it's well analyzed there. Fine. Let's continue. The next example. This endgame. So looks drawish. One extra pawn doesn't guarantee a win. Well, this is under attack. The draw is not guaranteed, but there is a chance for, well, if black plays properly, it will be a draw. But black has to make no mistakes. White's task is to provoke black to make a mistake. So which move to start with? What do you think? Does this move look good or not? Okay, 3rem suggests king d3. Fine. Does the e4 move looks good or not? The first question for you. There are still a lot of tricks. Okay, thanks, John. Thanks to RAM. E4 isn't good. E4 isn't good because there is rook f4. And after rook f4, either the pawn is lost or, well, or this position, in which white tries to promote, black tries to promote, but white also captures the pawn on g5. So right now, white doesn't have to rush. Their king is inside of the square of the pawn. But what? This move, king g5 just. King d5, then the pawn comes. If e6, black king stops it. And the white king has to capture the f pawn. So in case of e4, the pawn is lost or the rooks are traded, and then the g5 pawn is lost. So e4 isn't a good move. What else we have? This. This was played in the game. Now, is king f5 a good move or not? No, why king f5 is not a good move. So you see, white creates several traps for black in such a position. This move isn't good because of g6. What's the concept of g6? King takes, and after g7 there is no possibility of stopping the pawn. That's why rook f8 should be played. And after king f4, it seems white achieved something. Now they are attacking the pawn. If they win the second one, it still can be a draw, but such a draw becomes... well, then black has to play with only moves. That's why they play rook here. If they played rook f5, they won't be threatening to capture on g5. And this looks like a Zugzwang. Now, if they take, we definitely win this pawn endgame. We can promote because we simply shoulder the enemy king. So this move, this move, this move, this move, this, and we start pushing a pawn. And so on. So rook f5, just rook g1, and now what? If they move a rook, they blunder on e5. If they move the king, they blunder the rook on f5. That's why rook f5 doesn't look good again. So they have to play rook e8. This is a defensive line, but white tries to create a Zugzwang. Rook g1, rook e7. Now, what can we do? If we just keep moving the rook, black will do the same. What do you think? How should we play for a win then? It's still a draw if black plays properly. So rook a1 loses on g5. I think it will be a draw anyway then. King d5. Yeah, king d5 looks good. King d5 and then king d6. And after that, well, let's say king d6, rook e8 and e4. And this is a Zugzwang again. If this position will be reached, black will be in trouble because they would have to lose the pawn on e5. So that's why they play e4 extending space. For example, now this. rook goes to e8. If king d7, it's rook e5. And then it's actually a draw. So, for example, king d7, rook e5, king d6. Can you take there? It seems that yes, you can. You can take there. Rook takes, king takes. They will take our pawn. Oh no, it's a loss. So this move, and then we lose. Yeah, we lose. So rook e5, king d6, rook e8 then. Taking on g5 was a mistake. So rook g2. Moving the king means allowing them to advance the pawn, and then you have to move the king again. What else? Moving the rook means you no longer protect the pawn. So you cannot move on these three positions. Okay, so let's go back a little. So e4 was played, and your suggestion is to play this move. Interesting. What about this move? Now g6 is not playable. King d6 doesn't work neither. King d6, for example. What? I think this is enough. This is enough to draw the game. In this position, you just need to do what? This, and this. And if they take, then you hold a position. Black holds a position. So this, and this is a draw. If rook f4, king f5, rook f4, king g5. Now you can do rook f4, but if rooks are traded, white wins. But if not, if let's say something else like rook d7, rook a7, I like rook a7, then it's not. It's a draw again because the king can go back and the e pawn will be stopped. So that's why rook g4 doesn't win. That's why they played king d8. Rook goes to e8. And rook g2. No, black has no moves, but the e4 is not under attack, so they decide to play rook e8 move. Which does make sense because it keeps the rook active. They can attack on e3. They can keep delivering checks to the king from the side. So it looks fine. King f5. What do you think? How to play? No, I don't think so. How can you defend it like that? But then they attack it. Now if they take and it leads to a rook's trade, you're losing because after you capture on g5, just king f5 and they promote the e-pawn. So delivering a check, king f4. And after this check, king f3 and you're 2 pawns down. So which rook? When? So let's say rook in this position, rook f5. Okay, how does it help you? I'm going to advance the pawn. Because you cannot take on g5. It's always is a loss. Well, how do I play in this position? King e5 maybe is the best. Yeah, king e5. So black rook should go to a3. No, then you lose a pawn again. So rook a3, king e4, check, king e5, check, king e4, check, e4, and you are 2 pawns down. Which still means that you can draw the game, but this time you have to play the only moves. So the best move again is rook e8. Nothing seriously changed, but the king is already on f4, which means that the king from there is protecting the pawn on g5. How would you continue if you were black in this position? So rook e7, this is what Dan suggested. This is what 99% of all players would make. And the Ram suggests rook f8 check, but rook f8 loses the pawn on e4. No, actually, you're right. You're right, but it's really hard to realize that this is a draw. How is it a draw? So rook e8, king d3, for example, rook d8 check, king e2, rook e8, and the pawn is stopped. Now, in order to progress, you have to play king e3 or king d3, but then it leads to a check. What else you can do? Maybe you can try this move in order to advance the pawn further and so on. But just anything like rook e5, for example. Now e4, rook g5 is already a draw. Because this time the pawn goes first, not the king. Which means that black can successfully block it, occupying the reserved square on e6. So rook f8 was the best, sacrificing and then keeping checking the king. If king moves somewhere else, it's rook e3, and the g pawn is already blocked. If king goes well there, it's another check. King goes there, you can keep checking or just attack the pawn, because if they protect it, you have rook g5, which this time allows you to capture. So for example, this move. Capturing will be a mistake this time, but just bringing the rook back is sufficient. Now if e4 is played, no, actually I don't want it. It's still a draw, but I don't want this. So let me play just, well, rook g3 is played. Let me just play, let me just deliver a check. King d2, another check, king e2, and then I play this. This should be enough. Okay, so rook f8 was the only way to draw the game, because then you could deliver checks and white pawn will be blocked on e4. The situation would be completely different if the pawns were connected. Then definitely white wins anyway. Rook e7 was played. This is how the vast majority of chess players would play. And what can you say about this position? How white can get new ideas to play for a win this time? So I'm waiting for your suggestions. Okay, rook a2 and checking from the long side. Yeah, but rook a2, rook e6 maybe. But rook e6, you mean you can just make a waiting move? Okay, let's say rook a2. They just do what? King g7, let's say. Rook a6. Rook e... No, rook e8, not maybe rook. I don't know, rook b7. Okay. Okay, rook f7 check, king e4. Maybe this is still a draw. So yeah, rook a2 makes a lot of sense. It does allow you to play for a win. But the best is rook h2 with a check there. Yeah, okay, so rook goes there, check, and king captures on e4. And now in the game, black took, which was a mistake. It's still possible to draw the game if they play rook f8 and then continue checking, not allowing white to progress. But they took on g5, and that was the most critical blunder. So what's wrong with this move, with king g5? How you can exploit it? Well, with rook g2, but what's the purpose of rook g2? Yeah, exactly. Rook g2 cuts the king off, and that was the main feature. Rook g2, where does the king go? If he goes to f6, you can trade rooks, and then you definitely win because your king goes first. I can show you. Take and king e5. They do opposition, but you push the pawn, and now they have to move back. And then you have to play accurately, but it's winning. And then you promote. So king f6 doesn't work. King h6 or king h5 does work. They played king h5, but the king is cut off now, so you can play king d5 and try to advance your pawn. Rook f8, e4, check, king f5, rook e8, king f4. Rook delivers a check, king goes to e3, finally, and rook e8 back. What do you think how to play in this position? Yeah, so your task is to get a Lucina position. Exactly, but how? This is a draw. No, this is a win. Rook f2 to f5. No, this is a critical mistake, actually. Bringing the rook to the f file allows him to get his king back, and this is already a draw. Well, what you should remember is that you should try to block the enemy king, I mean cut it off, so the distance between the pawn and the king should be at least 2 squares. Rook g1, waiting move. That's probably the simplest way to play for a win. Then what? In the game, they played king h4, and king h4 lost the game quicker. But let's say they just play a waiting move rook e7. This allows you to come closer with the king. So check, king e5, check, king d5, check, king e6, and then you can progress. If they play king h6, then king f4. So check this, threatening mate, rook f8 another check, but king e7, and you can advance the pawn. What about king h4 move? How to play in this position? What's the simplest way? Well, king f4, it's rook f8. No, let me show you. So king f4, rook f8, king f5, check, king f5, check, king e6, check, and you cannot make a move with your king because you lose the pawn. So in this position after king h4, the best move was actually to push the pawn, because if only they take it, it's king f4 and there are two threats. So the game is lost. But if they play king h5, then the pawn is already far advanced and you can bring your king closer. And this is a win. So this, well, if they did start checking earlier, you would still reach e7. So king h7, e6, check. This attack from behind, but e7, king f6 is fine too. I will play king f6. And finally, we reached Lucina position. What do we need to do here to win the game? Okay, thanks. It's not rook f1, it's rook g4. Exactly. Rook g4, it's a rook lift, the so-called bridge. How does it win? So with this rook, we will block checks from behind. How does he play? Let's say he plays this move, for example. King f7, check. King here, check. King here, another check. King e5. And after this move, we can block with our rook and then promote. Zigzag, I would say it's bridge, because there is a rook lift. Well, the king maneuver, yes, it's a zigzag maneuver. Does rook g7 win? Yes, it's the common technique that we do in Lucina position. Well, what about rook g7? When do you want me to play rook g7? So e5, king h5. No, I don't think rook g7 would win. Okay, so probably you are talking about this position where they take king f4. No, this is where king f... No, it's not about this position. Okay, fine. So, well, what should we remember? When we have rooks on the board and one extra pawn, the game is not over. And a lot depends on the structure of the pawns and how far these pawns advanced and how weak other pawns are. However, rook in games, even without a pawn, have a lot of drawing tendencies, and your task is to find how exactly you can build a fortress to not let your opponent to progress. What you should remember. So, well, here we are not relying on a checkmate. However, checkmating the king can be an idea in one of the lines. For example, if it is a double attack, like it was king f4 in that concrete examples. But we are trying to attack enemy weaknesses and promote our passed pawns. And again, we create a lot of tactical opportunities based on the trade of rooks, because if the rooks are traded, opponent game should be winning. So in such endgames, don't agree to a draw too early. Instead, try to play for a win, creating traps for your opponent, because it's really hard for a club player to defend. Here, Grandmaster Yuri Balashov couldn't survive, but well, he is a very famous coach in Russia, and well, he definitely knows how to defend such positions. Probably nowadays he does know. Maybe that moment he was either under a time pressure or was just miscalculated. Well, he did well until the moment where he played king g5 move. With rook f8 he could keep checking. Let's continue. The third example. This is a rook endgame. The material is equal, but one small feature decides the game. White can still defend if they properly. What do you think? What is that feature that I'm talking? So this feature that increases black chances to play for a win. Can you specify why? So king here is suggested to protect the pawn. Okay, fine. Any other suggestions? King d7. Okay, but my original question was why? What is this specific feature which allows black to play for a win? And yes, Mark answered it properly. It's a badly rook placement. Then thinks that black can create an outside pass pawn. That's true, but much later. You cannot play h6 because your pawn is hanging at the moment, so you have to play king here, here, or here. And it seems that either these or these moves are our candidates, because the king would better go to f6. From f6 it covers g5. Black chooses to play king f7. It's still possible to defend. Well, they played rook g5, thinking that they can always escape with a rook. That was already a mistake, and after that, it's really hard to defend. Can you repeat? What do you want to play? H6. And if they play rook g4? Probably you want to play this move, but what I don't like about this position is the e5, and after king e5, the pawn on g6. Another attack, but then rook g5. And what did you achieve? And why do you think c5 is a good idea? So let's say they play what? g4, for example. Once they can get the rook back to the game, it should be a draw. So h4, let's say, to not let the rook to pass. But then this, king moves and f5. And now you don't attack the rook, and they are about to take on e6 or on g6. Who cares? You can take like that, but why do you think it's winning? Again, once you let the enemy rook to move, it should be a draw, because there are no other factors that can tell you that you should be playing for a win in this position. What factors? Passed pawn, your rook activity? No, you don't have these factors. No passed pawn, no, the rook is still not very well placed. If the c was a passed pawn, I would say maybe, but no, in this position, no. They can take here, they can do this, they can take on b6, the h is a weakness. What do you mean? So you want to win the pawn like that? You don't win the pawn then. This, rook b6 at least. This is coming. So h6 doesn't work as well as king f6 works. So rook g5. In the game, it was rook d8 played first. It wasn't obligatory, but this move made a lot of sense because the rook wants to invade and attack enemy pawns. King c2 stops the attack. Rook d4, a tempo move. b3, and then now king f6 was played. So the rook was improved at least. King f6, they defended with, well, with f4 is not possible because of rook e4. They defended with h4. And now there was a key move that you didn't suggest before. What is this key move? Yes, it's e5. Now the rook is trapped. Not h6, because h6 allows e5 and then the f pawn movements, but e5 ourselves. So now f4, for example, means they are pawn down. Take, and then if the rooks are traded, it's over. So rook g4 probably, but black will play for win. Don't know with which move they'd better do it, but it seems that rook e3 is good. Maybe b5 first to stop rook c4. Yeah, with extra pawn this time you have winning chances. Your king is closer to the place of action, and you have a chance to create a passed pawn. So the game continued with rook g4. Now, what do you think? How to continue? Should we start with h5? This is what probably white was hoping for. Okay, yeah. Well, you forced the rook to move to a passive position from which the rook cannot escape. That's why your next step can be a passed pawn creation. Okay, h5 is a candidate move. Let's first take a look at this opportunity. Rook goes there. So, for example, then b5. after which a takes, c takes, and they can play g4. And with g4, it seems that they can still get their rook activated. Now they take on h5 and win a pawn, or you take, and then they take with their rook, and their rook is still active. Okay, so let's go back. That's why the second stage, creation of a passed pawn, b5, a takes b5, c takes b5, king goes to c3, but a4. So after a4, we are threatening with b4 and a3, which creates a protected passed pawn, and the protected passed pawn means that one of the enemy pieces, in our case the enemy king, will be tied down to that passed pawn. So let me just, I don't know, show a random move. Let's say this: b4, king c2, a3, and the king has to take care about this pawn. Also, after g5, the rook is trapped. That's why they have to take b takes a4, and now they realize that they should let the rook escape, so they play f4 move. Could they play a better line? Let's say, what else? King b2. I don't see any other helpful moves, but let's try king b2. What do you think about this move, and what your strategy would be here? Rook d3. Okay, rook d3 makes sense, but then f4. Well, a3, you mean a3 take, do this, king b4, and you take on f3, but this is a pawn trade, while your pawn on a4 was a dangerous pawn, it was a passed pawn. Now it's not. Maybe you can play for a win if you play h5 here. So let's say king c4, h5, rook g5. No, I don't see how you can play for a win. You can try this move, but then the king goes that way. This, but g4. So you take there, they take here. It's likely to be a draw. a3, sacrificing the pawn will be a mistake. Rook d3, yes. But instead of rook d3, what if we play rook d2 first? Because if the king goes there, then we have a3. The rook is trapped. And if they take here, we promote. And even if king b3, we promote. So the king has to go to a3, stopping the pawn. But this means that we can still take. King takes a4, rook takes f3. We did sacrifice the pawn, but look at how further from the place of action the enemy, how far the enemy king is. Now, king comes there, but you can win a pawn there and then trade rooks. For example, king c4, rook goes there. I mean, rook goes to g5, the pawn is lost. And on the next move, how can you play? Rook d4, king c5, and rook g4. This should be winning because of extra pawn. Now they must take, otherwise they are completely losing. They must take. Now they come closer, but king f5, and now once the king moves, you promote. If the king goes that way, you capture the pawn on g3. This is winning. That's why king b2 wasn't played in the game, and it's actually hard to suggest a good move. They played f4, sacrificing the pawn. So rook e4. F takes e5 means what? King takes e5. Yeah, f takes e5 is playable. What is the best move? I think, yeah, I think taking with the king, because if we take with a rook, we lose a pawn on a4. But this should be winning too. We have a passed pawn, their rook is passive, and we are likely to win the pawn on g3 once we do this check. So the game continued with king d3. What's your opinion how to play? Okay, king f5 is a blunder. If you want to suggest king f5, it is a blunder. Rook e1, rook e1 if they... Yes, we can push our pawn to a3 because if the king takes, he is too far. For example, a2 takes, king e6, rook e4, but it's too late. Once we promote with pawns, this position is an easy win. Okay, so that's why. Actually, yeah, so a3 works well. Okay, wait a sec. Let me double check it. a3. If king e4, they are fine. We are fine. But if this move, we are not. Because if we take with a rook, and this time we must take with a rook, then it's rook a4. And then they take on a3. So it seems that a3 is a mistake. It works only if they capture our rook. If they capture the pawn, then, well, with the king we lose a rook. With the rook we lose the pawn on a3. So that's why, no, a3 doesn't look good. What else you can suggest? Even yeah, but they can come closer, so to stop your rook f3 move. They will take this pawn later. Okay, so now a3 fails. What instead of a3? Can you suggest a better move? Rook to b4 is a blunder. You lose your rook. It's still a blunder. It's a check and you. This is b4. This is b4. D4 you said. Okay, does it change anything? No, I don't think so. Well, let's say what they play. This move. Oh, king e3 move. Both options are fine, I think. Okay, no, it's not this neither. It's king g7. Well, you may include rook d4, king c3, and then play king g7, but you'd better keep the enemy king further from the a pawn. Now, capturing means you promote. And it's too late for white to do any actions. That's why after king g7, white continues with h5. However, a3 now works, and that's the end. For example, king c2, a2, rook e2, king b1, and then what? Then what? But if you play a2, king b2, rook a4, king a1, you can do much better. Now you can play e4. They can sacrifice, or they can play this move. Yeah, it seems to work for them. So e3, no, it fails. Okay. Okay, so that's why. Let's play this move first. Yes, you're right. Rook b4 is better. And then a2, a1. That's right. This is correct. Okay. Can you keep yourself muted? Thanks. King. Yeah, in the game it was king e4, but it's too late. Now the game is lost. Well, it's not the very end. They tried to build a fortress, but no, it's not possible. One of the pawns is lost, so they try to defend it with this move because g4 would lead would be quite disadvantages. Let me see why. Because of queen g3, I think. No, not because of queen. So I don't remember. But then the pawn is lost. Yeah, well, with king f7, with queen g3, with queen c6, you'll see it later. So they played rook g5, king f6, king moves, check, and soon they lost. So this looks like a fortress, but black managed to create a mating net. So rook e5. Why rook e5? Because now if the king comes, it will be checkmate. So queen c6 and so on. But you should be accurate. You shouldn't blunder rook e5. So queen c6, check. And if king b8, then you can bring your king and deliver checkmate. Like that. If they play king d8, then just queen b7. Then king, yeah, then not like that. So then they have to make a move. If they make a king move, you checkmate. If they push the pawn, then you take the pawn on f4. That's why they make a rook lift, after which you can continue with queen b6 and capture this pawn. So the game here was over after king f7. White resigned. Why did they resign? So, for example, if they play rook g5 back, it's king e7, rook goes here, and king d6, threatening the mate. Queen f5 when the king was on c5. Here, why do you think it's winning? So take this, 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 this. It's a draw. No. Here you should create mating nets in such a case. Okay, fine. So how to play with queen and the king versus rook and the king? It's not the point of our today's workshop, but today's the workshop is about major piece endgames. So here one small feature, the position of the king, the rook, allowed us to activate our king with tempi, activate our rook, and convert our pawn majority to a passed pawn, which finally decided the game. Let's continue with the next example. However, before we proceed, let me remind you that all workshops are free. However, if you enjoy this content and you would like to support my workshop, my work, and you can do it using these links. This works easily. You click this button, a new pop-up window appears where you enter the amount that you would like to donate. For example, 20 or 10 or 15, anything. You click the button. Then it redirects you to enter your PayPal account. You enter it, and then your money is automatically delivered to my PayPal account. I would appreciate it. It definitely helps me to support, to pay for my assistant's job. So they do these announcements, they do they prepare the games for me, then I choose among these games. If you want to support me using Wise, there is such a possibility. Wise doesn't take any commissions, so you can use this link if it's from Wise account to a Wise account. Fine. Also, please share this workshop with your friends, chess players, if you like it. And one more reminder. So we are about to finish our group classes, a series of group classes. There are 2 more lessons left. After that, there will be a 1 week, 1 or 2 week break. And after that, we are going to start a new series of group classes. This time, that series will be devoted to game planning, which I think everyone needs to work on, even including me. Fine. Well, let's take a look at this position. It should be a draw because white has, well, black has extra pawn, but these are double pawns, which means that it's very hard to convert these 4 to a passed pawn. 4 versus 3 into a passed pawn because these pawns are doubled. So that's why such in games are not so favorable for black. Well, it typically happens in Ruy Lopez, for example. Not only in Ruy Lopez, in Scotch game too, but here I think it's from Ruy Lopez. Okay, so what do we have in this position? What should we do to play for win? First of, well, the rook is well placed. Our king is cut off, which is a disadvantage, disadvantages for our position. The enemy king is cut off too, but it can go to d3 and d4. What we definitely should start with, who can tell me? And what we typically do in the endgames. I can actually answer this question myself. In the endgames, we are attacking enemy weaknesses. If there are no weaknesses, we are trying to create them. And this is exactly what black did in this game. Black started with rook a5. Exactly. This move provokes a3. Now this is under attack. This. Playing before allows us to undouble. That's why such a move wasn't played. They played king c2 and then rook d5. Rook d5 is a good move, no doubts, but there was a better way to play. G6, threatening to play rook f5, because in the pawn endgame, black is likely to win. In the rook endgame, not, but in the pawn endgame, yes, because of an extra pawn. And then the rook would invade f2. So g6 was a nice strategy, but instead this move was played. c4, rook d7. The concept is to keep the king cut off. This time it could make sense to continue with this move because c5 cannot be played in this position. They played king c3. Looks like a logical move, but black plays c5. And with c5 move, black grabs space and controls the d4 square, which can be a strong point or even the outpost for the rook. Rook f5 attacking it, b6. Good thing is about such a pawn structure is that we still have the pawn on c7 that protects on b6, which means that if we start attacking the enemy pawn and they start attacking our pawns on the queen side, they first have to take on c7, and that requires them to spend more tempi. Well, actually, these 2 scenarios, cutting the king on the king side from moving to the queen side and cutting the king from the queen side, preventing him to go to the king side, are approximately equal in this exact situation. If white doesn't make a mistake, we cannot convert a queen side pawn majority into a passed pawn. So that's why just cutting the king off, not allowing him to go to the center where he can participate in playing on both sides, makes a lot of sense. As for the king side, 2 versus 2 doesn't mean that we obligatory exchange them, and then there is nothing. It means that we, with our king, can invade the enemy camp and try to attack these pawns. So that's why we still have some chances if our activity with the king is sufficient. Later you see it. Black didn't do his best, but I'll show you what should be done instead. It's definitely related to the king side activity, so the king comes to h5 and then g4. Let me show you. So rook f3, rook d6, they played h4. There, that stops g5 because g5 was the goal, then the king comes, then rook f6 can be played. And rook f6 means that possibly there will be invasion into the enemy camp, or the rooks are traded. If the rooks are traded, black should be winning because of extra pawn. So h4, rook g6. We let the king to move, but this time we cut the king that way on the fourth rank. And this seems like an ideal position for the rook, because white pieces are tied down to the weaknesses. The king is tied down to c4, the rook is tied down to g3. To let the king to move, they played b3. King h7, king goes to e3, king g6. a4 was played to maybe to stop b5, but it's hard to suggest a good move. What do you think? If you were white, which move would you play? So b4 definitely is a blunder. A rook move is a blunder. King f2 move. Well, king f2 maybe, but what's the purpose of playing such a move? Let's say rook d4, king e3 again. Then I can try to, not sure, but maybe rook d1 and try to attack the weakness there. And then the pawn here. Again, king h5, king g4 is my strategy. Because if I attack the rook, I can always threaten with something like rook d3, distracting the king and capturing on f3. What about king d3 instead? So king h5. And I want to do this. But maybe first I have to move the pawn. Let me see. So let's say king e3 is still waiting. g5. H takes g5, h takes g5. King d3 again. Then I have this, this, and this. And now I am threatening with this move. Well, you can try to win the pawn on c7. And I don't think I have a possibility to save it. So that's why this, rook takes c7. But actually, this position looks good. Okay, I have a better suggestion. Let's not rush with this pawn. Let's take the pawn on b3. So you take on c7, but I take this pawn, and then a3 and g3 is lost too. So this is what I was telling about. White, in order to capture on b6, requires to spend extra tempi on capturing the pawn on c7, while black can attack the b3 pawn directly. So now this, king f2. Oh, it's not a free pawn. Let's not... yeah, but then you lose on a6. So let's not rush. What else can we do? Yeah, b5, but c takes and then we lose on c5. So by simplifying, by exchanging pawns, you make the position closer to a draw. If you want to take on a3, I think it does make sense to include this move. So I would say a5 first, then a4, because what they should do? They have to make what? like rook e6 or rook d6 move, let's say. They have to keep the rook attacking b6. Then a4. Okay, maybe actually they'd better play a4 themselves. Ah, but then it's rook b4, and then I can capture both pawns. Actually, let me deliver... Okay, a4, let me deliver this check and then capture with my king. So I'm still 2 pawns up, I'm going to advance, and I'm going to create one of these 2 pawns to make the second passed pawn. It should be winning. Yeah, a5 is the best strategy because I can keep the pawn on a5 alive. Okay, fine. So such strategy doesn't work. They played a4, and this is where a5 should be played. Then, for example, king f2, rook d4, the white's position is caged. So how do they play? King g2, let's say. King comes to h5. Now rook f7, but g5. Take, but with rook d3, you can capture there first, and the g3 will be lost. So it's almost the same situation. After rook b3, it's possible to play rook b4 and capture one more pawn. Okay. Fine, let's continue. Well, black made the mistake, they played king h5 first. Now what? The king goes to f2 to threaten rook f7. And they retreated back. Rook f8 was played and rook d4. So they tried to improve. King goes to e3, rook d1. And after rook f3, they repeated the position. Well, this is almost what we had before. Instead of this move, that they better try to progress, try to play aggressively. What would you suggest for white? How they can obtain a counterplay in this position? Rook c8? Well, no, rook c8, then rook here, and after rook c7, it's again this. So king f4, rook here, rook c6, king h5. Rook c4 with a check is coming, g5 is coming. It's a winning position. No, rook c8 doesn't work. King f4 instead. Well, I don't see the point of king f4. King f4, let me check first. Then king d5 can be played. Okay, good point. Let me then take on b3. Rook f3. Okay, actually, this is still better. And then I'm winning a pawn. So this, king c7, this. Okay, so take, king c7, rook b3. And now in order to win this pawn, you have to play something like that, but it's unlikely to work. Why it doesn't work? Because I can capture there and promote the g pawn first, right? So king h5, rook b6, rook takes b6, king takes b6, king h4. Then which pawn to take? King h6, let's say, g5, king b5, g4, a5. So we promote simultaneously. No, it doesn't work for us. So that's why what? Well, that's why let's push b5. Well, what else do we have? Actually, it seems that it is possible to draw the game once the king captures. Well, there is rook g1 move, by the way. So take, king c6, king h5, here, and this move. And this is the position where we are one tempo up. After rook b6, rook takes b6, we promote faster. g5, king a6, g4, a5, king here. Pawn g3, king to b6, pawn to g2, a6, pawn to there. Yes, and then you can play, well, then it is a win. I can show you. So king b7. Check. I don't like queen b1. Queen g, queen g2. Then what? King b8. Otherwise, we occupy this square. Then you play this move. How do they play? They can play, if king b7, then we take there. Let me show you. So now king c8, let's say. Wait a sec, I have a better suggestion. Why are we doing it? I was just covering a similar situation in... so let's do a staircase maneuver first. For example, king b7. Let's come closer, like that. Maybe like that, it works too. I wanted to deliver a check from there, but it fails. Yeah, we can. But we can play king g5, and if they push, then we trade queens. Then we promote much faster. Okay, so what I wanted you to show is the situation when the queen is on b6. Maybe I can reach it in a different way. Yes. Okay, so yeah, that's right. But I wanted to keep this pawn alive to avoid stalemating opportunity. So how it usually happens? No, let's say, yeah, well, okay. So usually it's, let's say, how, well, this. You play, well, it's a stalemate. But if you play this move, it is a stalemate, but they have a pawn, and then you have a nice checkmate. So this is what I wanted to create, but no. Then your scenario is probably the most simple and solid one. But this doesn't happen because I don't have a check from b6, and he won't voluntarily go to a8. So if it was king there and the queen on b6, he would have to. And then I would play queen c7, provoking king going back to the corner, and then queen c8. This time it doesn't work. But it's winning, obviously. So that is the concept. But king e4 was a... Well, which move did we try? King e4. Yeah, king e4 was a nice attempt. In the game, it was rook f3. But the best was a5 to try to weaken these pawns and exchange them. For example, rook b1, rook c8. Rook takes king e4. Rook, then what? Taking there means losing these pawns. So rook g3, rook c7 check. Oh, it's not a check. King this, and now this pawn is lost, or they have to take. But if they take, it's rook c5. And this can be a draw. King h5, c5, it can be a draw. This pawn is far advanced, and this king is closer to stop the pawns. It's likely to be a draw. If these pawns were already here, then white would lose. But because the king can stop it, because this is far advanced, it should be a draw. So this is what you need to remember. When you play the rook in game and you see you are losing, try to think about your activity, even if it costs you a pawn. Passive defense is likely to lose. Rook f3 is losing. Then check. Well, here a5 again was a better way. King f4, rook g1, then the king comes to g4. That was a scenario. So then you were asking me about what the king and two pawns can do versus two pawns. This is what they can do. The king waits and they create a passed pawn. So rook f4, king g3, and then black should be faster here. Oh, well, king rook here, then g5 right away, take, and king c7, king f3, and so on. And even maybe, yeah, king f3, rook moves. Where? Here maybe. But then rook can go there, and after rook b6, it's this. Okay, should be winning. In the game, it was rook e1, which is fine too. Rook e5. Again, rook b1 is a better move here, but rook e5 was played. So he keeps the king cut off, and white pieces are restricted. But no, you'll see what happens. So he covers the d7, so the white rook cannot invade. The rook d5, and white develops some activity. And how to win now? Well, this finally a5 was played, king f4, and it's still possible to draw the game for white, but black activates their rook, which is good. And here white should play this move, rook b1, rook c7, rook b3, but after this and this there is rook c6, and it was possible to take advantage of the of the activity of these pieces. So rook, king, and two pawns on the king side. For example, let's say rook c4, rook b6, rook a4, rook goes there. Now what about this pawn? If king goes there, it's a repetition. So check, king a7, back. Maybe he this time goes to g8, but if it goes to g8, I think it's king g6, rook g4. I think you need to play this move. Oh wait, which? So rook c7, because if c4, then there is king g6. But if rook c4, right, in my opinion, g5 works. Yeah, g5 should work here. If rook h4, then g6. And this passed pawn becomes dangerous. Okay, in the game, white made a mistake, and these are really strong players. So rook f5, king goes to e6, and now rook b1, but this time there is no invasion. So they have to defend the position passively, which allows us to deliver a check and play g5. So take, rook d5 seems to attack the pawn, but well, they played rook b1 in the game. That wasn't the best move. What is their best move? Okay, so the topic of the next class is not decided yet. I have a few ideas, but I don't know which one to choose. So you can message me with your own suggestion at tricksofchess@gmail.com. If you also are thinking about doing individual classes or joining our group classes, you also may send me a message. A request regarding it, I'll explain how it is, how do I conduct it. Okay, king of 6. No, king of 6, I don't see the point. They just play rook d7. Then you check, they go back. Well, you should check first. This check forces the king to go to the third rank. If it's this move, it's losing, right? Because you have rook d1. So take, and this should be winning. This, then king d6 or king f6. I think there is no big difference, but let's say king d6, king f5. And then this move, king g5. No, it's still winning. King g5, b5 takes, c4 takes, king takes, and then we promote the pawn much faster, because king h6, a4, g4, a3, and so on. Yes, we are much faster. So this is how we're winning. They cannot keep the king on the... Instead of king d3, I should play king f3. This is what you mean. But king f3, then rook b1. And now when they take on g5 and you capture there with a check. So rook g5, you capture there with a check, and then one of these pawns is lost too. So king f4, then the pawn will be captured with a check. So king g2, let's say. Then this. Well, it's losing. So even if this move is played, I can take one and then the second one. So here we have 3 passed pawns versus 1. It's definitely winning. With 2, I'm not sure, but with 3, it's definitely winning. So rook e1, including rook e1, is an intermediate move. If they, let's say, played king f3 and after rook b1, they could continue with this move, defending it. Then king f5, and we are threatening with g4. If this move, we go back, what they have to do? Well, this, again, rook b3, rook g5, king f6, and then these pawns are destroyed. But maybe instead they can go back and continue with this move. And if so, you can continue with king h5. So then g4. And if they play g4, then king h4, and the g pawn will be lost soon. This is how black could progress. In the game, they didn't play rook e1, they instead played rook b1 immediately, rook d3, now rook e1 check was played. It's the same position, actually, but here, white should play g4. They didn't make it, they played rook d7, and after that, that was losing. So this, again, so they have to take there, and then they lose on b3, and then these two are vulnerable. That's why they retreat, and after king h5, it's the same situation. So rook a3, rook b2 is a prophylaxis to cover these squares. After g4, the king would have to move further, but this means that we can deliver a check and play rook f3 or cut him off. So rook d3, waiting move, then this. Again, how to play? Well, g4 loses a pawn. If rook c3, then rook d4, and now Rook e3 again, and now we can play this to check from f7. So rook c3, check from f7. King goes to g2, and after king g4, they resigned. Why did they resign? So let's discuss it. Rook e3, for example, rook d7, aiming to go there. If the rook goes that way, it's rook d3, which is a double attack. That's why it does make sense to deliver a check, but after this check, the rook is under attack. Bringing the king fails because of this. So rook e8, for example. But then rook d2, and after that we can take the pawn on b3, and because of that win the game. Well, it was really quite complicated. But let's decide what happened there. So we had pawn majority on the queen side, extra pawn, but we couldn't convert it in a rook endgame. We couldn't create a passed pawn. However, this can be easily converted in a pawn endgame. That's why very often, well, one of our ideas was to offer a rook trade and pass the game to a favorable pawn endgame, to a winning pawn endgame, I would say. We cut the king off on the d file and could win the game with our king maneuver to the enemy camp. However, first let's provoke weaknesses. And then let's make this setup with a pawn on e5, which, let me show you just where was it. a5 was played, this setup. This setup looks strong because now if they want to take the pawn on b6, they have to spend extra tempo on capturing c7, which allows us to bring the rook and capture the pawn on b3 much faster. And that was the main idea. So the c7 was defending b6, and we could capture the b3 pawn faster than our opponent attacks the b6 pawn. Okay, fine. What you should learn is that when you have a lot of pieces on the board, for example, two rooks, so rook and the queen, together with creation of a passed pawn, you should be thinking about the attack on the enemy king. If you have only like one pair of major pieces, then you should create passed pawns, and always remember about the possibility of trading these major pieces and passing the game to the pawn in game, which can be winning either because you are a pawn up or because you have a far advanced pawns or your king is better placed. And if you're trying to defend such positions where you think you are losing, you'd better look for activity, even if it costs you a pawn. Okay, fine. So we are done for today. Do you have any questions? Yeah, but I can always block it with this, and after this, well, I take this pawn. Well, let me see. Maybe there is a better move. Maybe there is this move. That works too. Uh, uh-huh. Yeah, rook h2, it takes care of it. So this, and after the king moves, I can take on b3, and every time there is a check, I take there. No, I'm still capturing on g2, so it doesn't matter. Okay, fine. So g4 allowed the king to h4, and that still would be a winning position because of the ability of our rook to attack through the h file, and then the g4 pawn is lost. Okay, thank you for watching, and hope to see you next Sunday.